Hi, everybody. Welcome to English Digest. I'm Tom.
Hi, I'm Stephanie.
And it's our writing unit for the month of March. And we're going to be talking about your point of view. If you're writing a novel or something like that, you might need to decide on your point of view. Is it going to be first person? This is what happened to me. I was doing this, I was doing that. Is it going to be the second person, which is much more rare, which is rarer, and then the third person? He did that, she did that, etc.
Yeah, the second person is using you, but we'll talk more about that. We'll often just shorten this as a writer or when we're talking about writing. If you're in a writing class, they'll often just hear the teacher say, "What's your POV? What's your POV?" Which POV is being used? So we're going to talk about that so you'll be comfortable once you start taking literature courses. We'll use this expression in literature courses as well as writing courses. So let's get started.
When writers sit down to start a new story, they must consider their narrative point of view, or POV. Is the narrator a character, the reader, or an anonymous storyteller who describes the events? This is an important choice for authors, as each POV unlocks a different box of literary tricks. First-person POV tells the story from the narrator's perspective. They use the pronouns I and me to show everything they witness and feel. This POV immerses readers in the story and lets them share the characters' sufferings, desires, and internal conflicts. It's also great for mystery stories, since it allows the author to reveal each clue as the investigator uncovers it. A variation of this technique is called first-person omniscient. The narrator knows what every character is thinking. An example is The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak, in which the character Death tells the story. Second-person POV uses you as if the reader were actually a character in the story. It's uncommon in novels, but it works well in stories that let readers choose their own adventure and make decisions to complete a game book. An interesting use of second-person POV is in Homer's Odyssey, where Homer uses it when referring to the character Eumaeus, the servant of main character Odysseus. Some critics believe Homer does this to demonstrate the deep bonds of loyalty and affection between Odysseus and Eumaeus. Finally, third-person POV uses he, she, and they. There are two main categories, limited and omniscient. Limited POV sticks close to one character, only showing the reader what that person does and feels. A writer can broaden the scope of the novel by using multiple POVs. An example of this is George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series. In omniscient POV, an unknown narrator explains what every character is thinking and feeling. Many Victorian-era writers used this technique, for instance, Charles Dickens in A Tale of Two Cities. As you can see, writers are spoiled for choice when it comes to POVs. By experimenting, you too can find the best way to tell your stories.
Okay, guys, point of view. First, second, or third, meaning first person, second person, or third person. We often will joke about people who appear on TV especially, and they're talking about themselves in the third person. For example, they'll call themselves, for example, Fauci would always say, Dr. Fauci thinks this, and it talks about himself as if somebody else is saying what he's saying. So we kind of mock people when they use third person on themselves. So don't ever refer to yourself in the third person. For example, I could come to work and say to Tom, Stephanie thinks we should do 4 reels today and not 5. Just say, I think. So, yeah, we kind of make fun of that. Third person was used quite frequently by royalty back long ago, in Europe especially. So people who use third person to talk about themselves tend to think of themselves in a very elevated way. They think they're very important people.
I think the way you were describing that reminds me of Elmo on Sesame Street. If you're familiar with him, the little red monster, he talks that way. Elmo thinks that this is the case. Elmo wants to go here. Or something. He talks like that, refers to himself in the third person.
Hilarious.
But most people, of course, say, I want to go to the park, I want to play, etc., etc. So when writers sit down to start a new story, they must consider their narrative point of view, or POV. There are probably lots of things that you need to consider when you write a book or when you write a story or whatever.
True.
But we're focusing today on the narrative point of view. So narrative means having to do with the narration of the story, how you're telling the story. Basically, how are you going to tell the story? In what way are you going to tell the story? So basically that involves the point of view. Again, is it going to be first, second, or third person?
Yeah, you'll often hear this word narrative used in news these days. They'll talk about the media's narrative or how the media is portraying the story or the news that they're telling. So that's the point of view or how the story is being told. So when you see narrative, you can just substitute story for that if you get confused as to what narrative means. So is their narrator, notice we changed the zhongyin, is the narrator a character, the reader, or an anonymous storyteller who describes the events? Even in movies, Tom, I've noticed, they'll have narration sometimes. And sometimes the narration will be provided by one of the characters in the movie. And sometimes it's somebody who's just observing. It's very interesting to see how these choices are being made when someone creates their work of art, whether it's a novel, which is a work of fiction, or a movie that might be based on a novel or an original screenplay. So it's something to look at. See if you can pick out when you're listening to English or reading an English book, which POV is being used.
Exactly. And of course, this is an important choice for authors as each POV unlocks a different box of literary tricks. So it's important because it unlocks these different tricks here. So as here is just functioning as the word because. So it's an important choice you need to make as or because each POV unlocks a different box of literary tricks. Each point of view has its pluses and minuses, its advantages and disadvantages, and does different things to the story.
Now, moving on to the next paragraph, it says first person POV, or point of view, tells the story from the narrator's perspective. So the person telling the story is giving you their perspective or how they see things. Perspectives change based on the person, kind of their background, how they're feeling inside, how they're experiencing things. A person's perspective can be very important to listen to. Maybe you're fighting with your best friend and you feel like they're wrong, but the best way to resolve conflict is to listen to the other person's perspective. How do they view the situation? You might be surprised to find that they're seeing things a lot differently than you are. So it's important to listen to other people's perspectives. Again, it's just their attitude toward something, how they're looking at something or regarding something, their own point of view.
Right, so these people use the pronouns I and me to show everything they witness and feel. So I did this, they gave it to me, etc. That's first person. And this POV immerses readers in the story and lets them share the characters' sufferings, desires, and internal conflicts. Okay, so it immerses you in the story. To immerse means basically to sink somebody or put something in water. So in this particular case, you are immersed in the story. You're in the middle of the story. It's as if you're really there because this person is telling it to you straight from their perspective here. And I would say that this is probably the way a lot of diaries are written. They're in the first person. I did this today. I met my friend at the coffee shop. We studied there for a while. Then we went shopping, etc., etc. That would be first person narration.
Yeah, and the good thing about this, or one of the literary tricks or pluses, one of the positive points about it is that they can share the character's suffering, the sufferings, what they're going through. Suffering in non-count form just means all of the suffering that they're experiencing, their desires, what they really want, and any of their internal conflicts. If it's someone telling it from the outside, they couldn't really tell that with any accuracy. They'd be guessing how the character was feeling, or if they were having these, you know how characters will talk to themselves in their heads? Well, if you're telling it from third person, you can't just make up what they're thinking. So there are different literary tricks or things that can be used for the author who's writing things based on the POV that they select. So it's also great for mystery stories because it allows the author to reveal each clue as the investigator uncovers it. Yeah, so an investigator is somebody who is checking out clues about something. An investigator could be a police investigator. Maybe there's a crime, so they go to the crime scene and they look at all the facts. They get evidence, so they know who to possibly charge with some sort of crime that's been committed. If you uncover something, you're revealing something that's been unknown or maybe a secret up until that point. You can uncover a dish by taking the lid off a pot. You can uncover some truth by doing some investigation work. There are lots of ways to uncover something. You can also just uncover your bed by taking the blanket off, right? So you can uncover different things. Well, this is a way to uncover or reveal clues that might be there that the mystery writer wants to let the reader know about.
Indeed, and a variation of this technique, or a different way that this technique is used, a little difference in the technique, is called first-person omniscient. So again, a variation is just a little change. It's kind of the same thing, but it's a little different. Variation in prices, for example. There are variations in rent prices in Taiwan between the north and the south. They're more expensive in Taipei than they are in Taichung or Kaohsiung. There are variations. So, of course, we've got this first person omniscient. And omniscient kind of means you're back from the events of the story as if you know everything that's going on, including in the minds of the people.
Yeah, we also refer to God as being omniscient. God sees everything from beginning to end. Nothing is a secret. And here, if the narration is omniscient or the narrator is omniscient, they know everything. So they have the big picture, you could say. The narrator knows what the characters are thinking, and an example is this book called The Book Thief, which I read. It's set in World War II. It's very good if you want a good book to read, and it's not too difficult. The English is definitely possible for our listeners to understand. And this book is interesting because the character Death is actually narrating the story. You know, death as often pictured as that scary-looking creature with the hood on, and they have the scythe, that kind of hooked instrument that looks very scary. It's told from the viewpoint of death, which is always interesting. I had never read a book like that before.
Death is sometimes referred to as the Grim Reaper.
Yeah.
Okay, that brings us to the midway point in today's lesson. We're going to take a break right now and listen to our Chinese teacher.
听众朋友大家好，我是安娜。我们今天这个写作单元啊，要带大家来看看这个人称。人称在英文当中叫做 stance， S-T-A-N-C-E。这个人称当我们要写作，到底要用第一人称、第二人称还是第三人称呢？因为尤其是我们在说故事或所谓的记叙文的时候，我们要考虑一下我们要用什么样的角度来谈，也就是叙事的观点是什么？英文当中叫做 POV， 这在第一段的第一句最后一个字 POV， 也就是所谓的 point of view。那叙述者是角色，是读者，还是描述事件的一个匿名说书人呢？其实对我们来说是一个很重要的选择，因为每一种不同的观点啊，都会有不同的一些文学技巧，对于读者读起来你也会有不同的感受。好，我们看一下第一段最后一句第三句这个地方。第三句后面逗点之后有一个 as 如果当连接词的时候，在英文当中就有三个意思啦。When, because 或者是如同好像，只能够根据这个句子当中上下文去推断它的意思。在这里是表原因，因为每一个不同的观点都会开启一些不同的文学技巧。好，那么接下来我们就来看一下第二段咯。如果我今天要用第一人称，那么代名词常就会用 I 啊，或者甚至受词用 me 啊，用来表达所看到的、感受到的所有的一切。在第二段第二句的地方，我们看到一个关系子句，限定用法，先行词是 everything， 其实后面的关代 that 省略掉了。当然句子所谓的关系子句会从 they 到句尾的地方。我们刚刚说关代一定是 that， 因为先行词是 everything 这样子的强调字眼。好，那么如果我们用第一人称的这个观点呢，就可以让读者沉浸在整个故事当中，然后就可以分享角色的痛苦啊、欲望啊、内在冲突啊。对于悬疑故事来说很适合，因为它会让作者随着调查者发现线索，每一条的线索去揭开。好，我们特别看一下第二段第四句这个地方，有两个连接词，逗点之后呢，出现第一个连接词是 since。since 除了自从的意思之外，还有表原因 because 的意思。我们同样也要从文意当中来推敲。不过 since 之后呢，又出现了一个 as， 在这里的 as 是 when 的意思，当调查者揭开每一道线索的时候。好，那么接着呢，还有一种呢，如果我们用第一人称，它其实有一种变体，就叫做第一人称全知。虽然我在讲我的故事，爱，但是叙述者，也就是说故事的这个我呢，会知道每一个角色在想些什么事情。那这样子读者的话呢，他就可以进入每一个角色里面的想法。
We're going to take a quick break. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back, guys. We're talking about point of view as a writer. Are you going to choose to write in the first person, the second person, or the third person? We're kind of describing what these mean, but also why writers might choose a particular POV to use. So when we first started, we talked about first person, which is the narrator actually telling the story from their own perspective. And they know everything. They use the pronoun I or me to show that everything that they're talking about, they feel, they witness, they can see it.And this point of view just gets the reader to feel like they're really deeply into the story, they're immersed in the story. And you can also have a good idea about how the characters are feeling, how they're suffering, what they want, any sort of internal conflicts or internal dialogues they're having with themselves, how they're talking to each other. We call that self-talk sometimes. Now, a variation of this technique is called first person omniscient.This is also pronounced omniscient. I've heard that's a correct pronunciation. Tom and I both say omniscient. But the narrator in this particular variation knows what every character is thinking.And
second person POV uses you as if the reader were actually a character in the story. Now, it's uncommon in novels, but it works well in stories that let readers choose their own adventure and make decisions to complete a game book. So basically, if things are in the second person, or if they're using the second person point of view, you will hear the word you a lot, and they'll be referring to you, oh, you need to do this, you need to go there, as if you are involved in the story. Now, an interesting use of second person POV is in Homer's Odyssey, where Homer uses it when referring to the character Eumaeus. Okay, so of course the Odyssey was a story written by Homer. I think he also wrote the Iliad, and the Odyssey is the one about Odysseus traveling all over Europe to try to get back to his beloved wife who was being pursued by other men and stuff like that. By all the evil suitors. But in any case here, he's telling this story, or he's referring to the character Eumaeus, and that again is the servant of the main character Odysseus.
one of the types of writing that often uses second person are kind of self-help books. You know, you buy those books because you want to be a better person or lose some weight or something like that. And they'll write to you like, you need to exercise more than 10 minutes a day if you expect to gain some muscle. Or if you want to be more productive in life, you must get up earlier in the morning. We use second person a lot in self-help books. But if it's being used in a novel, it means the writer wants to include the audience in the whole process. So you'll end up feeling like you're one of the characters in the book. But again, it's very rarely used in fictional writing. So if you don't see it too often, it's not a surprise. It's not used that often in fiction. But as our writer here gets finished saying, it is used sometimes in stories that let readers choose their own adventure. You must open this door or open that window, things like that. Or maybe you make decisions to complete a game book. And Tom just talked about how it was used in Homer's Odyssey. Homer uses it when he refers to the character Ulysses. So it is used, but mostly rarely. Some critics believe Homer does this to demonstrate the deep bonds of loyalty and affection between Odysseus and Eumaeus. So if you have bonds or feel great bonds with somebody, feel a bond with someone, you can use it in a singular way too. Just means you have a good connection, you have a good friendship. There's loyalty, friendship, sometimes even love between you.
You bet. So far we've talked about first-person POV and second-person POV, and now we're going to talk about third-person POV. And finally, third-person POV uses he, she, and they. And to me, this seems to be the most common form of narration in novels.
I agree.
There are two main categories of third-person POV, however, limited and omniscient. So limited means it only goes so far, and omniscient means they basically can describe everything.
Now, here's one of our words, guys. Category. A category is a class or maybe a group or division of people or things, and they share similar characteristics, so you can put them in the same category. We'll often divide things up based on categories. For example, it could be similar to genre, where we use that in literature and music. You know, jazz is one kind of genre. You could use it in writing fiction, nonfiction. Those are different sorts of categories. Well, there are two main categories if you're using the third-person POV. I must say most novels I've read are in the third person. I tend to like novels in the third person more than I do in first person. But that's my particular preference, you could say. Now, a writer can broaden or widen the scope of the novel by using multiple POVs. Now, that's an interesting choice, where they're using maybe first person and third person in the same book. That can happen. I think it's a little bit more rare. We've got an example for you. But before we move on to that, let's talk about what scope means. What's scope, Tom?
The range, or how far something goes. So again, a writer can broaden the scope of the novel. He can make he or she can do all sorts of different things with the novel by using multiple points of view, or POVs. And again, you can jump around. You know, you can use the first person perspective, and then you can change the first person from one person to another. After all, everybody sees reality differently, and everybody thinks they're smarter than everybody else, so it's kind of interesting to hear how other people see things. You can change that around, or you can use second person, third person. So again, it can broaden the scope or the range of the novel, and you can do so much more with it that way. An example of this is George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series. He's also the writer of A Game of Thrones. And in Omniscient POV, an unknown narrator explains what every character is thinking and feeling. So we get the perspectives of all these different people. It is omniscient from this omniscient narrator. And many Victorian-era writers used this technique. For instance, Charles Dickens in A Tale of Two Cities.
Moving on to the final paragraph, as you can see, writers are spoiled for choice when it comes to POVs. If you're spoiled, it means someone's being extra generous toward you, extra kind. Maybe they're treating you with excessive kindness or consideration. Grandparents often spoil their grandkids. That's just the way it is. But if you're spoiled for choice, it means you were given so many choices, you just feel like, wow, this is great. I don't know which one I want. It's just wonderful. So you're spoiled for choice when it comes to POVs. We have lots of choices out there. If you prefer a particular POV, check out which POV is used before you buy or rent or borrow a book from the library. But it's good to experiment and see which one you like the best. I'm definitely someone who likes a third person when I'm reading fiction.
It's the easiest to understand. The other ones are, difficult if you're not used to it. And these are probably similar to points of view in Chinese writing as well. Okay, that brings us to the end of our lesson for today. Let's listen now to our Chinese teacher.
不过呢，接下来看到了第二人称。第二人称呢，使用的这个 you 啊，就比较不是那么常见啦。这个 you 的话呢，就是我们看到文字的时候会说，你今天早上起来，你如何如何，好像这个看书的这个读者，真的就是故事当中的角色。我们看一下第三段第一句哦，第一句中间有一个 as if。这两个字可以把它框起来，它是连接词，就是仿佛。仿佛的意思就是并不是真的。言下之意是 as if 后面一定会加与事实相反的陈述。像在这个句子当中，仿佛读者真的就是故事的角色。be 动词在假设语气当中，与事实相反的陈述当中，一律用 were， 所以我们看到它是一个假设语气的表达方式。As if the reader were actually a character in the story. 好，所以读者啊，如果再看你怎样怎样怎样，其实就是讲到读者自己，好像有选择自己冒险的那种感觉。所以如果是游戏故事的话，这个效果蛮好的。像在荷马的《奥德赛》里面啊，第二人称这个 POV 啊，这种观点就有一种很有趣的用法。因为荷马在提到他的主角还有他的仆人的角色的时候呢，就有使用到这样子的一个技巧。好，那么当然最后还有一个就是第三人称，也就是呢，写故事的人是跳脱的，好像在对着读者来说某一个另外第三者的故事，他 he she they 如何如何。不过有分为两个类别，一个就是有限的，所谓有限就是作者在谈这些角色的时候，不一定会陈述这些角色所有的想法。但是全知的话呢，则是作者好像知道每一个角色心中的想法。好，所以有限的 POV 其实就是紧贴着某一个角色，那这样子读者跟随着这个角色的时候，就可以展现这个特别角色的一些行为跟感受。我们特别看一下第四段的第二句的地方，所谓的有限的第三人称 POV 同时发生这样子的功能。好，那么如果是全知的 POV 这样子的一个角色的话呢，则是每一个角色的想法跟感受，作者都会描述出来。所以如果我们今天要谈 POV 做作者的这个写作的观点的时候，其实真的蛮多，也不好选择。不过呢，都各有特色，所以大家也可以挑选看看。以上是我们今天的内容，我们下次见。
Thanks for joining us, guys. We hope you learned a lot more about POV.So you'll be set in case you want to start writing in English or even in Chinese. Again, this probably refers to styles of Chinese writing as well. We're glad you joined us. We'll hope you come back again soon. But for now, we got to sign off, Tom.
We do. So that's it for today. Please join us again next time, and we wish you the best of luck in your writing career, if that's your career choice. From all of us here at English Digest, I'm Tom.
I'm Stephanie.
Goodbye.
Bye.